Hey everyone, we wanted to hop on it live today because it's the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. So I'm Megan, our communications manager at ASH, and I've got our policy director, Chris Bostic, and our staff attorney, Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, here to tell you a little more about what the anniversary is about and how it impacts ASH. So, Chris, do you want to tell us a little more about the background of the Declaration and kind of bring us up to today where it puts us?
Sure. So this was the first, the Universal Declaration was the first time that human rights have sort of been codified into international law. The concepts of certain rights that every human has have been floated around for a couple of centuries. I mean, think the Philosophes and the Rights of Man and the U.S. Bill of Rights, but it had never been put down into a concrete form for international governments. And during World War II, of course, the United Nations was formed in an effort to prevent another world war from happening in the future. And the UN realized that even though they talked about some rights, they hadn't really put down what those rights were. And so in 1948, 5 years after the United Nations was formed, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration in order to put at least the basic rights, the minimal rights that people have all over the world. This was a little bit of a way for governments to give up a tiny bit of their sovereignty so that human rights could be upheld around the world. Before that, sovereignty was absolute. You could do whatever you wanted to your own people, and no one could get involved. I think it's important to point out that after World War II, when the Nazis were tried for crimes, the prosecutors realized that they hadn't actually committed crimes in Germany because they had made sure that everything they did was legal. And they looked around for how they could convict people who had obviously done horrible things, and they settled on a human rights-based approach. And so this led to a plethora of other human rights treaties over the years, some on certain populations, some on certain rights like the right to health, which we'll talk about here. But this was the progenitor of 70 years of human rights advances around the world.
An interesting fact, it is the world's most translated document. It's been translated into over 500 languages.
Wow, that's awesome. Kelsey, can you tell us a little about what the Declaration means for our work in tobacco control?
So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights set out a right to life, which obviously pertains to tobacco control, as cigarette marketing and sale kills half of all of its users. Also, the UDHR was the progenitor of many more treaties, many of which include the right to health, which obviously also is part of our work. But there are others as well. The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Tobacco targeted advertising to women is growing worldwide, particularly in the third world. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, a lot of our issues pertain to that as well. And the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination as well, because targeted advertising is also often to racial minorities.
Awesome. And so how do you think that governments can get involved in this as well?
Governments have a duty to protect the rights of their citizens, and the tobacco industry is violating those rights. So the governments have an obligation to step in and help protect people.
Ideally, the tobacco industry, they're supposed to respect human rights on their own, but obviously they do not, and so that's where government's responsibility comes in. Human rights from a government standpoint is not just about what they don't do to their people, it's about what they don't allow others to do to their people.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the individual's right to smoke?
Yeah, that's a really strong argument if it wasn't for nicotine and addiction. People do have the right to liberty, and especially if you define liberty as the right to do anything that doesn't harm others, smoking would be allowed as long as it wasn't secondhand smoke and as long as it wasn't addiction. The problem is that most people start smoking before they're 18, which means that we don't allow them to sign contracts. They have a lot of other things that don't make them adults. By the time they turn 18, they're already addicted. And this isn't by accident. The tobacco industry has spent untold millions and 50 years making cigarettes and other tobacco products as addictive as possible. So the choice has been intentionally taken away from the victims of the tobacco industry, which pushed the onus back on the industry itself. They shouldn't be selling these products. And we've asked them to stop, and they said no.
That's very surprising, I think, that they didn't want to stop on their own. And so today, what can we do as organizations who are interested, but also as individuals who are concerned about the human rights violations of the industry?
So the first thing you can do is share this video, because most people don't think of tobacco as a human rights issue, and we want the world to start thinking of it that way. You can also sign on to our cease and desist letter that Chris mentioned. An organization can sign on to our Cape Town Declaration, which encourages the inclusion of tobacco as a human rights issue. What else am I forgetting?
Well, I would say, you know, if you're into local politics, let your local politicians know that the way we're doing things now with tobacco is unacceptable.
And you can always help by donating at ash.org.
Yeah, and I'll share links to all of the declarations and cease and desist letters in the description, but let us know if anyone has any questions. We're always open to continuing the conversation. And Chris and Kelsey, thank you guys both for chatting with us today.
All right, thanks.